Welcome back. Well, the Indonesian government have given signals that it could raise the price of subsidized fuel amid the still high price of global crude oil and the heavy burden it is putting on the state budget to subsidize fuel prices. Now, recently, the Indonesian Coordinating Minister of Maritime and Investments, Luhut Binsar Panjaitan, said that Indonesia's President Joko Widodo could announce a hike in subsidized fuel prices sometime this week. This is because the amount of state funds spent on subsidizing fuel is putting a heavy burden, on Indonesia's state budget. Now, in 2022, the Indonesian government is already spending a whopping 502 trillion rupiah on subsidizing fuel, which is 16% of this year's state expenditures. Indeed, the government has had to raise subsidies on fuel this year alone, as the Indonesian crude price index remains above $106 a barrel in July, which is 24% higher compared to January this year. Now, Indonesia's President Joko Widodo has lamented that Indonesia might eventually have to raise subsidized fuel prices because, for one part, it is so much lower compared to other countries. For example, the RON 92 fuel variant Pertamax in Indonesia is 84 US cents a liter, while in Singapore, the same RON 92 fuel is around $2 per liter. Indeed, ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine broke out last February, which pushed global oil prices well beyond $100 a barrel, Indonesia has yet to change subsidized fuel prices.
Kita ini Pertalite sekarang harganya masih berapa? 7.650. Gimana? Negara lain itu pun 18.000, 17.000, 32.000. Ya kalau dirupiahkan ya. Pertamax juga sama. Harganya sudah lipat 2 kali. Kembali lagi ini harus kita syukuri meskipun subsidinya sangat besar sekali, yaitu 502 triliun.
Right, so the question remains, will the Indonesian government increase subsidized fuel prices or not? And if so, how will that affect Indonesia's inflation and also growth this year? We're going to discuss more with Executive Director on the Center of Reform on Economics, or CORE Indonesia think tank, Mohammad Faisal. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Mas Krishna. Thank you for having me.
Right, so as we saw just now, the Indonesian government is clearly expressing plans to review the prices of subsidized fuel. Do you believe it will be increased, and in your estimation, by how much?
Yep, I do. The government has repeatedly sent signals of fuel price increase recently due to the running out of Pertalite stock. So the Pertalite stock, which is the subsidized fuel, by end of July is about 16.8 million kiloliters, while the quota is about 23 million kiloliters. It means that there is only about 6.2 million kiloliters left for the remaining 5 months of this year, from August to December. And Pertamina has said that the monthly consumption of Pertalite this year has increased to about 2.4 million kiloliters per month. So this means that the fuel will be running out in September or at the latest early October. So in this situation, there are 2 options. First, increasing the Pertalite price to reduce the government subsidy, or increasing the subsidy to keep the price the same. However, the Indonesian government is apparently worried that the energy subsidy has already been too high, which has reached, which as Pak Joko Widodo said, reached about 502 trillion rupiah this year, which means that the government seems to be reluctant to add the subsidy even further. So it is very likely that the Pertalite price will increase anytime soon this week.
Right, and by how much do you think it could go up?
As if the government said about 30%, it means that from 7,650 rupiah per liter to about 10,000 rupiah per liter.
10,000.
30% increase.
Right. So talking about the second option that you mentioned, increasing subsidies. Now, just explain to us, why is it that the government cannot afford to add more subsidies or spend more on fuel subsidies this year?
Yeah, actually, it's the government have seen that the burden on subsidy has been about 502 trillion rupiah for energy subsidy. But if we look at the how much it will affect if the government add further subsidy for the remaining 3 months of fertilizer consumption, say for example, in my calculations, about 50 trillion rupiah. So that means that the overall subsidy will be 550 trillion rupiah, and that means that the state budget deficit will increase from 3.9% as an estimate until the end of this year to about 4.1 to 4.2% at the end of this year. So if we compare it to the government target, the target is actually about 4.5%. So there is still room for actually to increase the deficit, because well, at the end of the day, the deficit is still lower than the target.
So there is still room to add subsidies, as you mentioned, but yet the government are still going to raise fuel prices anyway.
Yes.
As we know, global commodity prices are falling. Is the Indonesian government sort of worried about state revenues coming from commodity prices, which, as I mentioned, is falling?
Yep. Yeah. Actually, there is a tendency in the past couple of months that the global oil prices have fallen back to below 100 US dollars per barrel.
Right.
So in this situation, logically, the push to increase domestic fuel price is also weakening. So if the government finally increased the subsidized fuel price this month, there shouldn't be any more price increase of subsidized fuel until the end of this year. However, global dynamics is also difficult to predict lately. I mean, the oil price may have declined due to the fear of recessions, for example, but recently we have also seen an intensified geopolitical conflict, not just from Russia and Ukraine war, but also, for example, between China and Taiwan. Or recently also there is a heat wave disaster in China, which has lasted for over 2 months. So the general outlook of commodity price may be slowly declining, but I think we may also expect some twists and even surprises along the way.
All right, so many uncertainties lie ahead, many risks.
Yes.
Maybe the Indonesian government do not want to take further risks. Now, so if the Indonesian government finally decide to raise subsidized fuel prices, how will this affect inflation? Because as we know, back in 2014, when President Joko Widodo raised the price of subsidized fuel by a similar 30%, inflation went up to 8.3%. So how will this affect inflation now?
Okay, so as we know, inflation this year has significantly surged since early this year and has reached right now about 4.94% year on year. We estimate that inflation for the whole year this year will reach about 5.5 to 6%, even without an increase in domestic fuel price. So if the price of fertilizer, for example, is going to rise by 30%, then obviously the total inflation will be higher than 6%. So currently, fertilizer is the most consumed fuel in Indonesia. Its share to total domestic demand for fuel is more than 80% this year. Based on our calculation, every 10% increase in fertilizer can lead to a 1.2% surge in inflation, total inflation. So assuming that the increase of fertilizer price is 30%, as I said, from the current price 7,650 to 10,000, then the new price will boost inflation this year to 8% or even higher. So almost the same as the inflation in 2014.
All right, this is seems like some troubling times ahead in Indonesia in terms of prices. So also talk to us about the impact of a possible subsidized fuel price increase on food prices and also logistics in Indonesia.
The obvious direct impact of fuel price increase is the staggering inflation in transportation costs, which is associated with the logistics costs. However, we also know that logistics costs have strong correlations with food prices. And based on experience, we have seen that whenever fuel price rises, especially subsidized fuel, food prices also increases. In some cases, food prices have increased even before the rise in fuel prices is officially announced, which is a phenomenon of what we call as expected inflation. So if the Pertalite price increases by 30%, I predict that the inflation in transportation can increase by 5%. And the food inflation can increase by 4%.
Okay. Now, talking about economic growth in Indonesia, it's been quite positive. In the first 2 quarters, we're seeing consistent growth, higher growth in the second quarter, 5.44%. Now, that was driven largely by consumer demand, but now with rising inflation, as you mentioned,
right.
fuel price increase, food price increase, transportation cost increase. How will all this impact Indonesia's economic growth this year? Will we see positive growth still?
Yes, I think we still do. You can see positive growth this year, even though higher inflation will result in a weakening purchasing power, and this will potentially hold back the growth of the private consumption, which contributes about 60% of the Indonesian economy. But with a potentially 8% inflation impacted by the fuel price increase, I think it will be difficult for the private consumption to grow by over 5% this year, as was the case in the second quarter of this year, for example, recently. As the consequences, the overall GDP growth will fall below 5%, or to be more precise, GDP growth this year I think will fall between 4.5 to 5%.
All right, so you're
still positive,
right.
Still below than expectation.
Right, still positive, but below expectation, as you mentioned. Now, of course, as we know, today, Bank Indonesia raised interest rates to 3.75%. Is this an even worrying combination?
That's right.
Higher rates and also higher fuel prices for the Indonesian consumer.
That's right. Yeah, when fuel price surges, leading to higher inflation, then Bank Indonesia interest rates increase is just bound to happen. Bank Indonesia has said that the interest rate rise is a response to the government plan to increase subsidized fuel price. So we can see that the monetary is tightening following the fiscal tightening, and the impact on the economy is not going to be good, particularly with the current global situation.
Right, so the impact, it will be, but as you mentioned earlier, you're still seeing positive growth in Indonesia by the end of the year.
Positive growth.
Right,
Yes,
4.5 to 5%, if I'm not mistaken, you just mentioned.
Yep, yeah, that's true.
4.5 to 5%.